Hey there, welcome to Bradaros. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these tales give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The world was quieter than usual. Ever since Jonathan had returned from the labyrinthine dreams that had almost consumed him, the air around him felt heavy, laden with an invisible tension. He hadn't dreamt for days, at least, not that he could recall. But there were moments, fleeting yet disconcerting, where reality seemed to shimmer and distort, as if the dream was leaking into the waking world. It started with small things, shadows that lingered too long, voices that whispered just beyond the range of comprehension, and most disturbingly, the pulsing sensation from the mark on his wrist. What had once been a static emblem of unknown origin now throbbed rhythmically, as though it was alive, sensing something beneath the surface. Jonathan had tried to forget what Harold had told him about the Dreamweaver and the ancient forces tied to his family. He wanted to believe it was all just a series of elaborate nightmares, the byproduct of an overactive imagination. But the mark, the labyrinth, and the shifting reality he experienced suggested otherwise. That night, despite his best efforts to stay awake, sleep claimed Jonathan. As his consciousness slipped into the familiar void, he found himself once again standing in a world that defied all logic. The vast corridors of the labyrinth have returned, but something was different this time. The air felt charged with anticipation, as if something, or someone, was waiting for him. He began to walk, the echo of his footsteps reverberating through the empty halls. The symbols that lined the walls glowed faintly, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed as though they had a life of their own. It was then that he noticed the dog. A large, shaggy figure appeared from the darkness, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The creature looked at him, head slightly tilted as if recognizing him from a long-forgotten memory. "Who are you?" Jonathan's voice echoed in the vastness. The dog didn't respond verbally, but Jonathan felt a strange connection form between them. There was something familiar about the creature, something that tugged at the recesses of his mind. Without thinking, he reached out to touch its fur, and the moment his fingers made contact, a wave of memories washed over him. This wasn't just a dog. He could feel it now. There was something far deeper behind those eyes. As they moved through the labyrinth together, Jonathan found himself growing more and more comfortable in the presence of the dog. It moved with purpose, leading him down corridors and through doorways that seemed to open only for them. And with each step, the world around them grew more vivid, more real. Suddenly, the dog stopped. Jonathan followed its gaze to a mural on the wall, a depiction of ancient gods slumbering beneath the earth, their forms massive and grotesque. His heart raced as he recognized the sigils on the gods' bodies. They were the same as the one etched into his wrist. The dog, sensing his unease, pressed its head against his leg, offering an unexpected comfort. Then, in a moment that startled Jonathan to his core, a voice, not his own, spoke in his mind. "They are not dead, only dreaming." Jonathan stumbled back, his eyes wide as he looked down at the dog. You can talk?" The voice in his mind came again, calm and steady. "I am more than you think. I have always been with you." Jonathan's mind raced. He could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place, but it was too much, too fast. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice barely more than a whisper. The dog stared up at him, and for the first time, Jonathan saw the truth in its eyes. This was no ordinary creature of the dream world. This was his uncle, his mother's brother, who had vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances. "I am your guide," the dog said. "I have taken this form to help you understand the truth." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as the full weight of his uncle's words sank in. "The gods, the ones in the mural, they're real, aren't they?" The dog, his uncle, nodded. "They have slept for eons, buried deep beneath the earth, beneath our family's land. Their power has seeped into our bloodline, and that mark on your wrist, it is a connection to them." Jonathan instinctively rubbed the sigil on his wrist, feeling its pulse in time with his racing heartbeat. "But why me? Why now?" His uncle's voice was soft yet firm in his mind. "Because the time is drawing near. The gods are beginning to stir, and with them, the line between dream and reality is thinning. You are not the only one who bears the mark, Jonathan. There are others. And if the gods wake fully, the world as we know it will change forever." They continued deeper into the labyrinth, the atmosphere growing heavier, more oppressive. Jonathan's thoughts swirled with questions, but the weight of his uncle's words kept him grounded. If what he said was true, then their family was more than just a line of dreamers. They were the keepers of an ancient power, one that was tied to forces far beyond their understanding. But there was still one mystery that lingered in Jonathan's mind, the origin of the mark itself. "How did this happen to us?" he asked. "How did we become linked to these gods?" His uncle's silence stretched on for a moment too long before he answered. "No one knows for certain. The mark appears in every generation, but its origins are lost to time. Perhaps the gods chose us, or perhaps we were merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. The answer may lie with the gods themselves, but to ask them directly would be madness." Jonathan frowned. "Why?" "Because to speak with them in the waking world would shatter your mind. They are too vast, too alien for our mortal senses to comprehend. The only place where you might find answers is here, in the dream." As they reached the heart of the labyrinth, Jonathan saw it, a massive stone altar, covered in the same sigils as the mark on his wrist. The altar seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, its surface slick with a strange, iridescent liquid that seemed to reflect both the light and the darkness of the dream world. Jonathan hesitated, his hand hovering over the stone, feeling the pull of the power within it. It was as if the altar was calling to him, beckoning him to make a choice, but what that choice entailed, he couldn't yet say. The dog, his uncle, sat silently beside him, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Jonathan looked down at him, searching for answers in the canine's unblinking gaze. "The gods are stirring," the dog said, its voice echoing in Jonathan's mind. "They can feel your presence, Jonathan. They know you are here." Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What do they want?" The dog tilted its head, as if considering the question. "To wake," it said simply. "They have slept for eons, dreaming their dark dreams beneath the earth. But now the boundaries between their world and ours are thinning, and soon they will break free." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. "And what happens if they do?" His uncle's voice was soft but filled with an underlying tension. "The world will change, Jonathan. The gods will reshape it in their image, and everything we know will be twisted, altered beyond recognition. It will no longer be our world, but theirs." Jonathan's mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what his uncle was saying. The gods, these ancient, slumbering beings, held the power to reshape reality itself, and the only thing standing between them and the waking world was him. The weight of the responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. "But why me?" he asked again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why does it have to be me?" The dog looked up at him, its eyes filled with a sadness that Jonathan hadn't seen before. Because you bear the mark, it said. You are connected to the gods in a way that no one else is. You have the power to stop them or to set them free. Jonathan stared at the altar, his mind swirling with confusion and fear. The power within the stone seemed to hum in response to his thoughts, its pull growing stronger with every passing second. He knew, deep down, that the choice was his to make. But what was the right choice? Jonathan took a deep breath, his hand still hovering over the altar. The mark on his wrist was burning now, the pain sharp and searing, as if the gods themselves were trying to reach out to him. He clenched his fist, trying to block out the pain, but it was no use. The mark was alive, pulsing with the same energy that filled the altar. You are the key, the dog said, its voice barely audible in Jonathan's mind. The gods have chosen you to either open the door or keep it shut. But be warned, whichever choice you make, there will be consequences. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at the mark. It had always been a part of him, something he'd never fully understood. But now, standing in the heart of the labyrinth, he realized that it was more than just a symbol. It was a bond, a link between him and the ancient gods who slumbered beneath the earth. And now, it was up to him to decide whether that bond would be severed or strengthened. How do I stop them? He asked, his voice trembling with fear. The dog tilted its head, its eyes glowing softly in the darkness. The gods are bound by the dream, it said. As long as they remain in their slumber, their power is contained. But if they wake, the dream will become reality. Jonathan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what his uncle was telling him. The dream was the key. The gods were trapped within it, unable to fully manifest in the waking world. But if the boundaries between the dream and reality continued to blur, they would eventually break free. And if I wake them? Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog didn't answer for a long moment. When it finally spoke, its voice was filled with a quiet sadness. Then the world as you know it will cease to exist. Jonathan stared at the altar, his mind filled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he wanted to stop the gods from waking, to protect the world from their dark influence. But on the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something his uncle wasn't telling him. What are you not saying? He asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. The dog hesitated, its eyes narrowing slightly. There is another way, it said slowly. A way to control the gods' power without waking them. But it is dangerous, more dangerous than anything you have faced so far. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. What is it? The dog turned its gaze toward the altar, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The gods are bound by the dream, it said. But their power can be harnessed if you are strong enough to wield it. Jonathan felt a surge of hope. You mean I can use their power without waking them? The dog nodded, its expression serious. Yes, but it will come at a cost. Jonathan swallowed hard. What kind of cost? The dog looked up at him, its eyes filled with an emotion that Jonathan couldn't quite place. Your mind, it said simply. To wield the gods' power, you must enter their dreams. And once you do, there is no guarantee that you will ever wake up. Jonathan's heart sank. The choice before him was more dangerous than he had imagined. He could stop the gods from waking, but only by risking his own sanity. Or he could let them sleep, but leave the world vulnerable to their eventual awakening. How do I make this choice? He asked, his voice trembling. The dog didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer to the altar, its eyes glowing brightly in the darkness. "The choice is yours, Jonathan," it said softly. "But remember, whatever you choose, you must be prepared to face the consequences." Jonathan stared at the altar, his mind racing. The power within it seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, calling to him, beckoning him to make a decision. He knew that once he touched the altar, there would be no turning back. Taking a deep breath, Jonathan reached out toward the altar, his hand trembling with fear and anticipation. The mark on his wrist burned with a fierce intensity, as if urging him forward. He hesitated for a moment, his mind filled with doubts. But then he remembered his uncle's words. The gods were stirring, and the boundaries between dream and reality were weakening. If he did nothing, the world would be lost. He had to act, even if it meant risking everything. With a final surge of determination, Jonathan placed his hand on the altar. The moment Jonathan's hand touched the altar, the world around him trembled. A shockwave of energy surged through his body, as if he had tapped into a current too powerful for any human mind to endure. He gasped, the air around him crackling with an otherworldly force, and his vision blurred as he was pulled deeper into the labyrinth of dreams. The dog, the specter of his uncle, watched in silence as Jonathan was consumed by the power of the gods. His form flickered, distorting between the familiar shape of the dog and something else, something far older, far more dangerous. Jonathan's mind teetered on the edge of collapse, and as the altar's energy flooded through him, he was suddenly no longer in control. He was falling. The world beneath him twisted and turned, and Jonathan found himself in a vast, cosmic expanse, the edges of his consciousness touching something ancient and infinite. Stars spun in an incomprehensible dance, and beneath him, far below, lay the endless void, the space where the gods slumbered. Jonathan heard their whispers, faint, but growing louder with every passing second. Their voices clawed at his mind, tugging at his thoughts, filling his soul with dread and wonder. "Who dares disturb our sleep?" The voice was deep, echoing through the void, shaking the very fabric of the dream world. Jonathan felt the weight of the gods' awareness pressing down on him, and he knew he was standing at the threshold of their domain. Before him, shapes began to emerge, vast, dark figures that stretched beyond his comprehension. They were the gods, their forms shifting and flickering in the darkness, too immense and alien for Jonathan to fully perceive. "Is it you, dreamer?" one of them hissed, its voice like the grinding of ancient stones. "The one marked by our seal?" Jonathan swallowed hard, trying to keep his thoughts clear, but the weight of their presence was overwhelming. He felt his mind begin to unravel as the god's eyes turned toward him, each gaze a piercing force that cut through his very soul. "I..." Jonathan stammered, his voice barely audible in the vast expanse. "I seek to understand the power, the mark." The gods laughed, their voices a terrible cacophony that shook the stars. "You seek to understand?" one of them rumbled. "You, who bears the mark of our will. You are but a vessel, dreamer, a conduit through which our power flows." Jonathan felt a chill run through him. "But why me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why my family?" The gods were silent for a moment, their forms shifting in the darkness. Finally, one of them spoke again, its voice slow and deliberate. "Your bloodline is bound to us," it said. "The mark you bear is a covenant, a pact made long ago by those who sought our power. Your ancestors called to us, dreamer. They sought to harness the forces that lie beneath the earth, and in return, they gave us their lineage." Jonathan's heart raced. His family, his ancestors had made a deal with these gods? But for what? And why had he never known? Why now? Jonathan asked, his voice hoarse. Why are you waking now? The gods laughed again, their voices like thunder. The world is changing, dreamer. The veil between the waking world and the dream is thinning. Soon, we will break free of our slumber, and the world will be remade in our image. Jonathan felt a surge of panic. No, I won't let that happen. The gods' laughter faded, and their voices grew colder. You have no choice, they said. You are bound to us by the mark. You cannot escape your fate. Jonathan felt the weight of their words settle over him like a suffocating shroud. His mind reeled, trying to process what they were saying. His family had made a pact with the gods, and now, centuries later, that pact was coming to fruition. But why had they done it? What had they gained in return? The gods, sensing his confusion, spoke again. Your ancestors sought power, dreamer, they said. Power over life and death, over the forces of nature, over the very fabric of reality. And we gave it to them. In return, they bound their bloodline to us, ensuring that one day, a descendant would awaken us from our slumber. Jonathan's mind raced. His family had sought power, and in return, they had enslaved their descendants to the will of these ancient gods. But what could they have possibly wanted that would justify such a terrible price? As if reading his thoughts, the gods continued. Your family gained much from their pact with us, dreamer, they said. They were able to bend reality to their will, to shape the world as they saw fit. But all power comes with a price. Jonathan felt a surge of anger. And now I have to pay that price? The gods were silent for a moment, their forms shifting in the darkness. Yes, they said finally. You are the one chosen to fulfill the covenant. You are the one who will either awaken us or keep us in slumber. Jonathan's mind was spinning. He had come here seeking answers, but the truth was far more terrifying than he had imagined. His family had made a deal with these gods, and now he was the one who had to decide whether to continue that legacy or break it. But what if I refuse? He asked, his voice trembling. The gods' laughter echoed through the void. You cannot refuse, dreamer. The mark binds you to us. You are ours, whether you wish it or not. Jonathan clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let the gods awaken and reshape the world in their image. But how could he stop them? The answer came from an unexpected source. You don't have to fight them alone. Jonathan turned, and there, standing in the midst of the void, was the dog, his uncle's spirit, still in the form of the dog, but now more human in its presence. Its eyes glowed with a strange, otherworldly light, and Jonathan could feel its power radiating outward. They are not as invincible as they would have you believe, the dog said, its voice calm and steady. They can be stopped. But you must act quickly. Jonathan stared at his uncle, hope stirring within him. Ow! The dog stepped forward, its form shifting once again between the canine and the human. Their power is tied to the dream. If you can sever their connection to the dream, you can keep them in slumber. Jonathan frowned. But how do I do that? The dog looked at him, its eyes filled with a quiet determination. By going deeper into the dream. You must find the source of their power, the heart of the dream itself, and destroy it. Jonathan swallowed hard, his mind racing. The heart of the dream, it sounded impossible, but if it was the only way to stop the gods, he had to try. With his uncle by his side, Jonathan plunged deeper into the dream. The landscape around him shifted and twisted, growing darker and more distorted with every step. The god's presence loomed ever closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. But Jonathan pushed forward, determined to find the heart of the dream and end this once and for all. The journey was long and treacherous, filled with nightmarish visions and challenges that tested the limits of Jonathan's sanity. But with his uncle's guidance, he pressed on, drawing closer to the source of the god's power. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the heart of the dream, a vast, pulsating mass of darkness, radiating an intense, almost tangible energy. Jonathan stared at it, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The source of the god's power. The heart of the dream. He stepped forward, his mind filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew that destroying the heart would not be easy, and it would come at a cost. But he had no other choice. With a deep breath, Jonathan reached out, his hand trembling as it made contact with the heart of the dream. And then, everything exploded. A surge of energy coursed through Jonathan's body, and he felt his mind split apart as the dream world collapsed around him. The gods screamed in rage, their forms writhing and twisting as their power was ripped from them. But Jonathan held on, his will unshakable. He could feel the heart of the dream disintegrating beneath his touch, and with it, the god's connection to the waking world. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the heart shattered, and the dream world collapsed into darkness. The void collapsed around Jonathan, plunging him into total darkness. The only sensation he could register was the dull throbbing of his heartbeat echoing in the vast emptiness. For what felt like an eternity, he floated in nothingness, unsure if he had succeeded or merely traded one nightmare for another. But then, faint whispers began to stir in the distance. They grew louder, more distinct, until Jonathan realized they were not the voices of the gods, but voices from the waking world. Suddenly, he was pulled back, his eyes flew open, and he found himself lying on the cold stone floor of the family mansion, the eerie moonlight casting long shadows across the ancient walls. The house was quiet, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for him to return. His hand, still glowing faintly from the touch of the heart of the dream, felt heavy. The mark had not vanished, though something about it had changed. It pulsed softly now, not with the malevolent energy of the gods, but with something deeper, older, as if the connection had been severed, but not fully destroyed. Jonathan pushed himself up slowly, his body aching from the ordeal. The dog, his uncle, sat beside him, watching silently. "It's over, isn't it?" Jonathan asked, his voice hoarse. "I stopped them." The dog's eyes glowed softly in the dim light, but it did not respond right away. Jonathan felt a sense of unease creeping over him. "You've delayed them," the dog finally said, its voice echoing in Jonathan's mind. "But the gods do not sleep forever. The dream is not truly destroyed, it is merely fractured, for now." Jonathan's heart sank. "So, I didn't end it?" The dog shifted, its form blurring between the canine and the human, his uncle's familiar presence comforting yet distant. "You weakened them, but their connection to your bloodline remains. As long as the mark exists, the gods will always have a way to reach you, or those who come after." Jonathan's mind raced. This was not the victory he had hoped for. The gods were still out there, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to return. And he was still bound to them by the mark. "I don't understand," Jonathan said, frustration creeping into his voice. "If I can't destroy the mark, what was the point?" The dog, his uncle, stood and approached him, its eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. "The point Jonathan, is that you now know the truth. You understand the power you carry and the responsibility that comes with it. Jonathan swallowed, feeling the weight of those words. He looked down at his hand, the mark still faintly glowing in the darkness. It was no longer just a curse, it was something more. Something he would have to live with and learn to control. But what if the gods come back? Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jonathan saw his uncle's face clearly, a memory of the man who had always been a guiding light in his life. If they return, you will be ready. You have the strength to face them now. Jonathan nodded slowly, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had faced the gods in the dream world, but how could he possibly be ready to face them in the waking world, if it came to that? Is this the end? Jonathan asked, his voice heavy with uncertainty. The dog's form shimmered, and for a moment it was fully human again, his uncle, standing before him, all and real. This is not the end, Jonathan. This is only the beginning. With those words, the dog, his uncle, began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows of the mansion. Jonathan reached out instinctively, but there was nothing to grasp, only the cold air and the lingering presence of something far greater than himself. As the silence settled around him once more, Jonathan was left alone in the dark, the weight of his family's legacy heavy on his shoulders. The gods had been stopped, for now, but the mark on his hand remained a constant reminder of the power that still lurked beneath the surface, waiting to be awakened. And somewhere, deep below the earth, the gods stirred in their slumber, their dreams twisting and turning in ways that even Jonathan could not yet comprehend. Days passed, and Jonathan began to explore the mansion in greater depth, trying to piece together the fragments of his family's history that had been kept hidden from him for so long. Each room seemed to hold a secret, a memory of those who had come before him, those who had made the pact with the gods, binding their bloodline to a fate they could not escape. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan found himself drawn to the old library, its shelves lined with dusty tomes and forgotten relics. He had avoided this room before, feeling a sense of dread every time he passed by, but tonight was different. Something called to him. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of old paper and time-worn wood. The room was vast, its walls lined with books that seemed to stretch on forever. In the center of the room, a large desk stood, covered in ancient scrolls and journals, the remnants of his ancestors' research into the occult. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then crossed the room to the desk. He picked up one of the journals, its leather cover cracked and worn from centuries of use. As he opened it, the pages felt brittle beneath his fingers, but the writing inside was still legible. The journal belonged to his great-grandfather, one of the key figures in his family's dark past. As Jonathan read, he learned more about the pact that had been made with the gods, how his ancestors had sought power and knowledge beyond the mortal realm, and how they had ultimately paid the price. But there was something else, something buried deep within the pages of the journal. A clue, perhaps, to the mystery that still lingered in Jonathan's mind. He turned to the final entry, written in a shaky hand, as if his great-grandfather had been on the verge of madness when he penned it. The words were scrawled hastily, but their meaning was clear. The mark, it is not just a curse. It is a key to something far greater than we could have imagined. The gods, they are not the only ones who dwell in the dream. There is something, someone, watching from the shadows. Waiting. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine as he read those words. The gods were not the only forces at play in this twisted reality. There was something else out there, something even more powerful, more dangerous. He closed the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. The revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating. The dream was far more complex than he had realized, and the mark on his hand was not just a symbol of his family's bondage to the gods, it was a link to something much larger. Jonathan knew then that his journey was far from over. The gods may have been delayed, but there were other forces at work, forces that he would have to confront if he wanted to truly understand the nature of the dream and his place within it. And as he stood in the dimly lit library, the weight of his family's legacy heavy on his shoulders, Jonathan made a silent vow. He would find the truth, no matter the cost. The days blurred into weeks, and Jonathan found himself drawn deeper into the mysteries of his family's past. The mansion, once a place of fear and confusion, had become a labyrinth of secrets, each room offering a new revelation, a new piece of the puzzle. But as Jonathan delved deeper into the history of the mark and the gods, he began to notice strange things happening around him. The air in the mansion seemed to hum with an unseen energy, and shadows danced in the corners of his vision, disappearing the moment he turned to look at them. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of his growing obsession with the dream world. But soon, the strange occurrences became too frequent to ignore. Doors would open on their own, lights would flicker without explanation, and at night, Jonathan would hear faint whispers echoing through the halls, as if the mansion itself was alive, watching him, waiting for something. One night, as he lay in bed, Jonathan was jolted awake by a loud crash from downstairs. His heart raced as he sat up, his mind immediately going to the gods and the dream world. Had they found a way to breach the waking world? The moonlight streaming through the cracked window threw eerie shadows across the room. The dog led the protagonist to the center of the dreamscape, a field where the sky seemed to ripple like water. "You think you control this world," a voice echoed, though the dog had not spoken aloud. The protagonist turned sharply, realizing it wasn't his imagination. The voice, deep and resonant, filled his mind, and when he looked at the dog, he saw something different in its eyes, a glint of recognition, a presence far older than anything he had known. "This world was never yours," the voice continued, "but it is tied to you and to all your bloodline." The words reverberated inside him, shaking loose fragments of memories he didn't know he had. His heart raced as the ground beneath them pulsed with ancient energy. The dog's form flickered, revealing glimpses of another figure, his uncle. But not as he remembered him. His uncle's face appeared both young and ageless, as if the passage of time held no meaning. "You're more than you know," the dog, now fully transformed into the spectral image of his uncle, spoke with a clarity that froze the air. "We have all carried this mark, this connection to the Ancient Ones, but none have wielded it as you will." The protagonist felt the symbol on his wrist burn hotter, and with it, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. The protagonist's pulse quickened as his uncle's apparition loomed over him, a silhouette woven from both shadow and dream. Around them, the dreamscape shimmered with an otherworldly light, bending and warping as if the air itself was alive. The skies churned with dark clouds, and beneath the ground, an ancient force stirred, a power the protagonist felt rising to the surface. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, his mind grasping at the enormity of the revelation. "What is this mark? What does it mean?" His uncle, now more spirit than man, knelt beside him, their eyes locking. "The mark is the key," he said. "The key to worlds beyond this one. It binds you to them, just as it binds you to the sleeping gods." The protagonist stared down at the glowing mark on his wrist, feeling its heat intensify. The symbol pulsed like a heartbeat, a silent but undeniable reminder of something greater waiting just beneath the surface of his consciousness. The sensation felt both familiar and foreign, like a memory long forgotten but now clawing its way back into his mind. The gods are dreaming, his uncle continued, his voice now tinged with both reverence and dread. They lie beneath the earth, beneath the mansion, waiting. Their slumber is deep, but not eternal. One day, they will awaken, and it will be through you. The words sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. He staggered backward, his legs trembling under the weight of the revelation. But I don't understand. What am I supposed to do? The ground beneath them trembled as though responding to his words, and the sky darkened further, the swirling clouds now resembling the depths of an ocean. You were never meant to understand, his uncle replied, his voice softer now. You were meant to be a vessel, a conduit for their will. But the choice is always yours, whether to accept it or fight it. Fight it? How can I fight something so vast, so ancient? There is power in resistance, his uncle said. But that power comes with a cost. The dog's form flickered again, and for a moment the protagonist found himself standing alone in the darkened field. The air grew cold, and the silence became suffocating. He was surrounded by eerie stillness, but in the distance, faint whispers began to rise, carried on the wind like the voices of the dead. He knew those voices. They had been haunting him for years, creeping into his dreams, filling his mind with half-formed thoughts and cryptic warnings. But now they seemed louder, more insistent. What do you want from me? The protagonist shouted into the darkness, his voice breaking the stillness. Tell me what I'm supposed to do. The ground trembled again, more violently this time. The earth beneath him cracked open, revealing a gaping abyss that stretched into the infinite. From the depths, a light began to glow, dim at first, but quickly growing brighter, more intense. He backed away from the edge, but the light drew him in, like a moth to a flame. The whispers grew louder, the voices merging into a cacophony that overwhelmed his senses. He covered his ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside his head now, clawing at his mind, tearing at his sanity. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The ground stilled, the wind died, and the light from the abyss dimmed. For a moment, there was silence. Complete and utter silence. The protagonist lowered his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. In the eerie stillness, a figure emerged from the light. It was tall, its body cloaked in shadows, its face obscured. But the mark on its wrist glowed with the same ethereal light as the protagonist's. I've been waiting for you, the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, like the tolling of a distant bell. You've been chosen, just as I was. The protagonist took a step forward, his breath caught in his throat. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped into the dim light, and for the first time, the protagonist saw its face, his own face, but older, more worn. It was like looking into a mirror, but the reflection showed him a version of himself that had lived through untold horrors, had seen things that no mortal should ever witness. I am what you will become, the figure said, its eyes gleaming with a strange, otherworldly light. If you continue down this path, if you accept the mark, this is your future. The protagonist felt his legs give way, and he fell to his knees. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, this isn't possible. I can't. It is already happening, the figure said, stepping closer. The gods are waking. The power you feel, the dreams, the voices, they are all signs of what's to come. You cannot stop it. I don't want this, the protagonist said, his voice breaking. I never asked for this. The figure knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "None of you has asked for it," he said softly, "but it is our fate." The ground trembled again, and the light from the abyss grew brighter. The figure stood, its eyes fixed on the glowing mark on the protagonist's wrist. "The time has come," it said, its voice now filled with an unsettling finality. "You must choose. Accept your fate or fight it. But know this, there is no escape. The gods will awaken, whether you are ready or not." The protagonist looked down at the mark, his heart pounding in his chest. The symbol burned brightly, pulsing with a power he could barely comprehend. He felt the weight of the choice before him, the weight of his fate. And then, in the distance, he heard the familiar voice of the dog, his uncle, calling to him, guiding him back to the surface of the dream. "Choose wisely," the figure said, its voice fading as the light from the abyss swallowed it whole. The protagonist's pulse quickened as his uncle's apparition loomed over him, a silhouette woven from both shadow and dream. Around them, the dreamscape shimmered with an otherworldly light, bending and warping as if the air itself was alive. The skies churned with dark clouds, and beneath the ground, an ancient force stirred, a power the protagonist felt rising to the surface. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, his mind grasping at the enormity of the revelation. "What is this mark? What does it mean?" His uncle, now more spirit than man, knelt beside him, their eyes locking. "The mark is the key," he said. "The key to worlds beyond this one. It binds you to them, just as it binds you to the sleeping gods." The protagonist stared down at the glowing mark on his wrist, feeling its heat intensify. The symbol pulsed like a heartbeat, a silent but undeniable reminder of something greater waiting just beneath the surface of his consciousness. The sensation felt both familiar and foreign, like a memory long forgotten but now clawing its way back into his mind. "The gods are dreaming," his uncle continued, his voice now tinged with both reverence and dread. "They lie beneath the earth, beneath the mansion, waiting. Their slumber is deep, but not eternal. One day, they will awaken, and it will be through you." The words sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. He staggered backward, his legs trembling under the weight of the revelation. "But I don't understand. What am I supposed to do?" The ground beneath them trembled as though responding to his words, and the sky darkened further, the swirling clouds now resembling the depths of an ocean. "You were never meant to understand," his uncle replied, his voice softer now. "You were meant to be a vessel, a conduit for their will. But the choice is always yours, whether to accept it or fight it." "Fight it? How can I fight something so vast, so ancient?" "There is power in resistance," his uncle said. "But that power comes with a cost." The dog's form flickered again, and for a moment, the protagonist found himself standing alone in the darkened field. The air grew cold, and the silence became suffocating. He was surrounded by eerie stillness, but in the distance, faint whispers began to rise, carried on the wind like the voices of the dead. He knew those voices. They had been haunting him for years, creeping into his dreams, filling his mind with half-formed thoughts and cryptic warnings. But now they seemed louder, more insistent. "What do you want from me?" the protagonist shouted into the darkness, his voice breaking the stillness. "Tell me what I'm supposed to do." The ground trembled again, more violently this time. The earth beneath him cracked open, revealing a gaping abyss that stretched into the infinite. From the depths, a light began to glow, dim at first, but quickly growing brighter, more intense. He backed away from the edge, but the light drew him in, like a moth to a flame. The whispers grew louder, the voices merging into a cacophony that overwhelmed his senses. He covered his ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside his head now, clawing at his mind, tearing at his sanity. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The ground stilled, the wind died, and the light from the abyss dimmed. For a moment, there was silence. Complete and utter silence. The protagonist lowered his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. In the eerie stillness, a figure emerged from the light. It was tall, its body cloaked in shadows, its face obscured. But the mark on its wrist glowed with the same ethereal light as the protagonist's. "I've been waiting for you," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, like the tolling of a distant bell. "You've been chosen, just as I was." The protagonist took a step forward, his breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped into the dim light, and for the first time, the protagonist saw its face, his own face, but older, more worn. It was like looking into a mirror, but the reflection showed him a version of himself that had lived through untold horrors, had seen things that no mortal should ever witness. "I am what you will become," the figure said, its eyes gleaming with a strange, otherworldly light. "If you continue down this path, if you accept the mark, this is your future." The protagonist felt his legs give way, and he fell to his knees. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, this isn't possible. I can't." "It is already happening," the figure said, stepping closer. "The gods are waking. The power you feel, the dreams, the voices, they are all signs of what's to come. You cannot stop it." "I don't want this," the protagonist said, his voice breaking. "I never asked for this." The figure knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "None of you has asked for it," he said softly. "But it is our fate." The ground trembled again, and the light from the abyss grew brighter. The figure stood, its eyes fixed on the glowing mark on the protagonist's wrist. "The time has come," it said, its voice now filled with an unsettling finality. "You must choose. Accept your fate, or fight it. But know this, there is no escape. The gods will awaken, whether you are ready or not." The protagonist looked down at the mark, his heart pounding in his chest. The symbol burned brightly, pulsing with a power he could barely comprehend. He felt the weight of the choice before him, the weight of his fate. And then, in the distance, he heard the familiar voice of the dog, his uncle, calling to him, guiding him back to the surface of the dream. "Choose wisely," the figure said, its voice fading as the light from the abyss swallowed it whole. As the vision of the future self dissolved, the protagonist felt a cold sweat form on his brow. He was back in the dreamscape, the strange twilight world where time twisted and shifted, where nothing was real, yet everything mattered. The presence of his uncle, in the form of the dog, was comforting but unsettling at the same time. The dog padded closer, its eyes glinting with intelligence far beyond that of any earthly animal. Its breath fogged in the cool air as it spoke, but not in words. The voice came directly into the protagonist's mind, clear and resonant. "Do you understand now?" The voice was calm, patient. "The path ahead is not one you chose, but it is the one that has been laid before you. The gods stir beneath your feet. You have felt it, haven't you?" The protagonist nodded slowly, still trying to grasp the magnitude of what he had witnessed. "I felt something," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I don't know what it means. These gods, these forces, they're beyond me. I don't even understand why this is happening to me." The dog, or rather his uncle, tilted its head, considering the words. It's because of the bloodline, the voice explained. Our family has always been tied to the Ancient Ones. The mark on your wrist, it's not just a symbol. It's a contract, a bond between you and those that lie beneath. The protagonist's gaze drifted to the mark, which still glowed faintly, even here in the dream. He traced the intricate design with his fingers, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it. It wasn't just a mark, it was alive, pulsating with a hidden energy. But why me? He asked again, frustration creeping into his voice. What does this have to do with me? I didn't ask for any of this. The dog sat down on its haunches, watching him with a patience that only a creature tied to ancient mysteries could have. You didn't ask, it said, but you were chosen. The gods do not care for what mortals desire. They move through time and space, indifferent to the whims of men. But they saw something in you. A potential. And now, they have begun to wake. The ground trembled beneath them, ever so slightly, as if to punctuate the words. The protagonist's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed answers, clearer ones than cryptic warnings and vague hints of destiny. If they're waking, he began, his voice stronger now, what am I supposed to do? You said I had a choice, to accept this fate or to fight it. But how can I fight something I don't even understand? The dog's eyes glowed brighter for a moment, and then it turned, facing the distance. The landscape had changed again, as it always did in these dreams. The fields of twilight had given way to a vast, dark forest. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches twisted into shapes that resembled clawing hands reaching toward the sky. Follow me, the dog said, padding forward into the forest. There are things you must see. Things that will help you understand. The protagonist hesitated, glancing at the shifting landscape around him. This place, this world, nothing stayed the same for long. It was all too easy to lose yourself in the labyrinth of the dreamscape. And yet, he felt a strange pull, an urge to follow the dog deeper into the shadows. Reluctantly, he took a step forward, then another. The air grew colder as they ventured into the forest, the trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. The sky above had darkened, and the only light came from the faint glow of the mark on his wrist. As they walked, the dog's voice continued to resonate in his mind. The gods that sleep beneath the earth are ancient beyond comprehension. They were here long before mankind, long before the world as you know it. They dream of the times before time, of worlds that have been forgotten, and of powers that can reshape reality itself. The protagonist listened intently, the weight of the words pressing down on him. And what do they want with me? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. They want you to be their vessel, the dog replied. To carry their will into the waking world. The mark you bear, it is both a gift and a curse. It grants you power, yes, but it also binds you to them. As long as the mark is on your skin, you are connected to their dreams. And as they awaken, so too will their influence over you grow. The trees around them seemed to whisper, their branches swaying in a wind that didn't exist. The protagonist shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. So I'm just supposed to let them take over? Is that it? No, the dog said, stopping in its tracks. It turned to face him, its eyes locking onto his. That is where your choice comes in. You can accept the power they offer, use it to your advantage. Or you can resist, try to sever the bond. But either way, the gods will wake. And when they do, the world will change. The protagonist felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still terrifying. "And if I fight it?" he asked. "If I try to break free?" The dog was silent for a moment, as if considering its answer. Finally, it spoke. "There are ways to weaken the bond," it said. "But they come at a cost. You would need to enter their realm fully, confront them in their slumber. It is a dangerous path, and one that few have survived with their sanity intact." The protagonist swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "But it's possible?" "It is," the dog confirmed. "But you must be prepared for the consequences. The gods do not take kindly to defiance. And even if you succeed, the mark will never truly leave you. It will always be a part of you, a reminder of the power you once held and the price you paid to escape it." They had reached the heart of the forest now. In the center of a clearing stood an ancient stone altar covered in moss and vines. The air around it hummed with a strange energy, and the protagonist could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The dog approached the altar, its eyes glowing brighter than ever. "This is where it begins," it said. "This is where you make your choice." The clearing felt timeless, like it had been untouched for millennia. The stone altar seemed older than the forest itself, its surface worn smooth by the passage of countless years. The protagonist approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog, still sitting beside the altar, looked up at him with knowing eyes. "This is where the bond was first forged," it said. "Long before you were born, long before our family even knew the power that ran through its veins." The protagonist's hand went instinctively to the mark on his wrist. The glowing symbol seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, growing warmer the closer he got to the altar. He could feel it drawing him in, as if the very stones themselves were calling to him. "And what am I supposed to do here?" he asked, a hint of fear creeping into his voice. The dog stood, its body casting a long shadow across the clearing. "You have two choices," it said. "You can place your hand on the altar, accept the power that has been offered to you, and become a vessel for the gods. Or you can try to resist, to break free of the bond and sever your connection to them." The protagonist stared at the altar, his mind racing. He had come so far, seen so much, but the idea of submitting to the will of ancient, slumbering gods was terrifying. And yet, the thought of fighting them, of entering their realm and risking everything, was equally daunting. "What happens if I accept?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "If you accept, you will gain power beyond anything you've ever known," the dog explained. "The gods will grant you their strength, their knowledge, their ability to shape reality itself. But in return, you will be bound to them forever. You will become their servant, their tool. And when they awaken fully, you will be their herald." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. The protagonist took a step back, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of the decision before him. "And if I refuse?" he asked. The dog's eyes glowed even brighter. "If you refuse, you will have to enter their realm, confront them in their dreams. You will have to face the gods themselves and find a way to sever the bond. It is a dangerous path, one that few have survived. But if you succeed, you will be free. The mark will fade, and the gods will lose their hold on you." The protagonist's heart raced. Both options seemed impossible, yet he knew he had to choose. The weight of his family's legacy, of the power that had been passed down through generations, pressed heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't help but wonder what his ancestors had done, what choices they had made to bring him to this moment. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, his voice cracking. The dog padded closer to him, its gaze softening. "You're stronger than you think," it said. "You've already come this far. The fact that you're here, standing at the crossroads, means you have the strength to face whatever comes next." The protagonist looked down at the mark on his wrist. It was glowing brighter now, as if it could sense the decision that was about to be made. He could feel the power thrumming beneath his skin, the ancient energy that had been passed down through his bloodline for centuries. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I need to know more," he said. "Before I make my decision, I need to understand. You said the gods are waking, but why now? What's changed?" The dog hesitated for a moment, as if considering its answer. "The world is changing," it said finally. "The boundaries between realms are thinning. The gods have sensed this, and their slumber has grown restless. They are stirring because they feel the time is near for their return." The protagonist frowned. "And what happens if they return? What will they do?" The dog's gaze grew dark. "They will reshape the world in their image," it said. "Reality, as you know it, will cease to exist. The gods have no regard for human life, for human desires. They see the world as something to be molded, to be controlled. If they awaken, everything will change." A cold chill ran down the protagonist's spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was terrifying. "And there's no way to stop them?" he asked. "There is always a way," the dog replied. "But it requires great sacrifice. The gods can be delayed, perhaps even put back into their slumber, but it will not be easy. And it may come at the cost of your own life." The protagonist swallowed hard, his throat dry. "So those are my options," he said. "Become their vessel, or try to stop them and risk losing everything." The dog nodded. "Those are the choices before you. But remember, once you make your decision, there is no turning back." The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He had always known that his family was different, that there was something strange about the mark on his wrist. But he had never imagined that it would come to this, that he would be standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of ancient, unknowable gods. He looked at the altar, then back at the dog, his uncle, his guide. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but he knew that he couldn't avoid it any longer. "I need time to think," he said finally. "I can't make this decision right now." The dog regarded him with a knowing look. "The gods are patient," it said. "But their patience is not infinite. The longer you wait, the more they will stir. The more they will influence your dreams, your thoughts. The choice will not get any easier with time." The protagonist nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But still, he couldn't bring himself to choose, not yet. "I'll be back," he said, turning away from the altar. "I just need time." The dog watched him as he walked away, its glowing eyes following him into the shadows of the forest. "You don't have much," it said softly, though the protagonist was already too far away to hear. As the protagonist ventured deeper into the forest, the weight of his decision bore down on him like a shroud. The trees around him seemed to whisper, their branches creaking in the wind, as if the very world itself was aware of the burden he carried. Each step felt heavier than the last, and his mind churned with thoughts of the ancient gods and the power they held. The dog's words echoed in his mind. The choice will not get any easier with time. But how could he make such a decision without knowing the full scope of what he was facing? The ancient gods, the mark on his wrist, the power that coursed through his veins, none of it made sense. He needed answers, but he knew that those answers wouldn't come easily. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. Turning sharply, he saw a figure emerging from the shadows of the trees. It was a woman, her face half hidden by a hooded cloak. Her eyes gleamed with a strange, ethereal light, and she moved with an eerie grace, as if she were gliding through the forest rather than walking. "Who are you?" the protagonist asked, his hand instinctively going to the mark on his wrist. The woman smiled faintly. "I am one who knows the path you walk," she said, her voice soft yet commanding. "I have walked it myself, long ago." The protagonist's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean? Have you dealt with the gods?" She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "I, too, bore the mark," she said, lifting her sleeve to reveal a faint, glowing symbol on her own wrist. It was faded, barely visible, but it was unmistakably the same mark that the protagonist bore. "I, too, face the choice you now face." The protagonist's heart raced. "And what did you choose?" The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep sorrow. "I chose wrong," she said quietly. "I became a vessel for their power. For a time, I thought I could control it. I thought I could use it to shape the world as I saw fit. But the gods, they are not easily controlled." She took a step closer, her eyes gleaming with intensity. "The more power I wielded, the more they took from me. My will, my mind, my very soul. Piece by piece, they consumed me until there was nothing left but a hollow shell, a puppet for their desires." The protagonist felt a chill run down his spine. "And now?" The woman's voice grew softer, almost a whisper. "Now, I am but a shadow of what I once was. A warning, if you will, to those who come after me. The gods have allowed me to linger, to serve as a reminder of what happens to those who give themselves to their will." The protagonist swallowed hard, his throat dry. "So you're saying there's no hope? That no matter what I choose, I'll lose?" The woman shook her head. "There is always hope," she said. "But it is a fragile thing, easily lost. The gods are not invincible. They can be resisted, but it requires great strength and cunning. And even then, the cost is high." Her eyes bore into his, filled with a deep, unspoken pain. "You must choose carefully, for once the choice is made, there is no turning back." The protagonist stood in silence, his mind swirling with uncertainty. He had always known that the mark was a curse, but he had never imagined the full extent of the danger it represented. Now, standing before this woman, a living testament to the horrors of the god's power, he realized just how close he was to losing himself. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The woman stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You are stronger than you know," she said. "But strength alone will not be enough. You must also be wise. You must understand the nature of the power you carry and the dangers it brings." She gestured to the trees around them, where shadows seemed to flicker and dance in the corners of his vision. "The gods are always watching. They are always waiting. And they will use every trick, every manipulation, to turn you to their will." The protagonist clenched his fists, feeling the mark on his wrist pulse with a faint warmth. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The woman's gaze softened. "You must find a way to sever the bond," she said. "You must enter their realm, confront them in their own dreams. Only there can you truly understand their power and find a way to break free." Her words struck a chord within him. The dream realm, it had always been a place of mystery, a place where the gods held sway. But it was also a place where he had glimpsed the truth, where he had seen the boundaries between reality and dream blur. "How do I enter their realm?" he asked, determination creeping into his voice. The woman smiled faintly. "You already know the way," she said. "The dreams you've been having, they are the key. The gods are trying to lure you into their domain, to trap you in their web of illusions. But if you can navigate the dream world with a clear mind, you can turn the tables on them." The protagonist nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in his mind. He had always been able to control his dreams to some extent, but now he would have to take it a step further. He would have to face the gods on their own turf, challenge them in their own realm. But before he could act, the woman stepped back, her form beginning to fade into the shadows. "Remember," she said, her voice growing faint. "The gods are ancient and powerful, but they are not omnipotent. They can be outwitted, but only if you keep your wits about you." And with that, she was gone, leaving the protagonist standing alone in the clearing once more. He looked down at the mark on his wrist, feeling the power coursing through him. The gods were watching, waiting for him to make his move. But this time, he wouldn't be a pawn in their game. This time, he would be the one to set the rules. The night was still, but the weight of the woman's words lingered in the air. The protagonist took a deep breath and gazed at the mark on his wrist, feeling the pulsating power beneath his skin. The ancient gods, the dream realm, the promise of freedom, it all seemed so distant and unreachable, yet he knew he had no choice. If he wanted to reclaim his life, to rid himself of this curse, he had to face them. As he moved deeper into the woods, a low growl reached his ears. He froze, scanning the trees around him. From the shadows emerged a pair of glowing eyes, watching him intently. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure stepped forward, revealing the dog from his dreams, the same one that had guided him before. The dog approached cautiously, its fur shimmering under the moonlight. There was something familiar in its gaze, something that stirred the protagonist's memory. He knelt down, extending a hand, and the dog sniffed it before pressing its head gently against his palm. "You again," the protagonist whispered. "Are you here to guide me?" The dog's eyes gleamed with a strange intelligence, and it let out a soft bark as if in response. Slowly, it turned and began walking, glancing back at the protagonist as if urging him to follow. Without hesitation, he stood and trailed after the dog, deeper into the forest. As they walked, the air around them seemed to shift. The trees took on an otherworldly glow, their branches swaying in a wind that didn't touch the ground. The stars overhead twinkled unnaturally, brighter and closer than they should have been. It was as if the boundary between reality and the dream realm was blurring, folding in on itself. Suddenly, the dog stopped at the edge of a clearing. The protagonist followed its gaze and saw a massive stone archway standing in the center, ancient runes carved into its surface. A faint light pulsed from the archway, beckoning him forward. "This is it, isn't it?" the protagonist asked, though he wasn't sure if he was asking the dog or himself. The dog let out another soft bark and nudged his leg, urging him toward the archway. The protagonist took a step forward, then another, until he was standing just before the entrance. The air was thick with a strange energy, the kind that made his skin prickle with anticipation and fear. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the archway. The world around him seemed to dissolve, melting away into a sea of swirling colors and shifting shapes. His senses were overwhelmed, sights, sounds, and smells he couldn't begin to describe washed over him all at once. He felt like he was falling and floating at the same time, suspended in a place that existed beyond time and space. And then, with a sudden jolt, he landed. he found himself standing in a vast, desolate landscape. The sky above was a swirling vortex of dark clouds, crackling with electricity. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and barren, stretching out endlessly in all directions. In the distance, towering mountains loomed, their peaks shrouded in mist. The dog was by his side, watching him carefully. "This is the dream realm," the protagonist muttered, his voice barely audible. "The realm of the gods." The dog barked softly in response, as if confirming his thoughts. As the protagonist took in his surroundings, he felt a presence, an overwhelming, oppressive force watching him from the shadows. The gods were here. He could feel their eyes on him, studying him, waiting to see what he would do next. He took a deep breath and began to walk, the dog trotting alongside him. The landscape seemed to shift with every step he took, the ground warping and changing beneath his feet. One moment he was walking on cracked earth, the next he was trudging through thick, viscous mud. The sky shifted from stormy gray to an eerie red, and the mountains in the distance seemed to move closer and farther away at random. This was a world ruled by the gods' whims, a place where reality bent to their will. As they walked, the protagonist's mind raced. He knew he needed to confront the gods, to find a way to break the bond they held over him. But how? What could he possibly do against beings so ancient and powerful? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rumble. The ground beneath him shook violently, and he stumbled, nearly falling. The dog barked sharply, and the protagonist looked up to see a massive figure emerging from the mountains ahead. It was a giant, towering over the landscape, its body made of swirling smoke and shadow. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and as it moved, the very air around it seemed to tremble with its presence. The protagonist's heart raced. This was no ordinary creature, this was one of the gods, an ancient being that had existed long before his time. And it was coming for him. The dog growled, stepping in front of the protagonist as if to protect him. But the god paid no attention to the dog. Its glowing eyes were fixed on the protagonist, and it raised a massive hand, pointing directly at him. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed in the protagonist's mind. "You dare enter our realm?" The protagonist swallowed hard, his legs trembling beneath him. But he stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I've come to break the bond," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I've come to free myself from your control." The god's laughter rumbled through the air, shaking the very ground. "Foolish mortal," it said. "You are bound by forces far beyond your understanding. You think you can break the bond? You think you can defy us?" The protagonist clenched his fists, feeling the mark on his wrist pulse with energy. "I won't be your pawn," he said through gritted teeth. "Not anymore." The god's eyes gleamed with malice. "You will always be ours," it said. "No mortal can escape the will of the gods. You are nothing but a vessel, a tool for our power." The protagonist's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. He had come too far to turn back now. He had faced the gods in their own realm, and he wasn't about to let them win. "I will find a way," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I will break free." The god's laughter echoed once more, but there was a hint of something else in its tone, something like doubt. "We shall see," the god said, its voice fading as its massive form dissolved into the swirling mist. The protagonist stood there, breathing heavily, his heart racing. The dog nudged his leg, and he looked down to see its calm, steady gaze. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He wasn't done yet. As the god's presence faded into the mist, the protagonist's mind buzzed with the weight of the encounter. The words of the ancient being echoed in his thoughts, "You will always be ours." The finality in that statement sent a chill down his spine, but there was also a flicker of hope. The hint of doubt in the god's tone hadn't gone unnoticed. The dog at his side nudged him gently, urging him to move forward. He could feel the pull of something greater, an unseen force guiding him deeper into the dream realm. There was more to discover, more to understand, and he wasn't about to give up now. As they ventured further, the landscape continued to shift and warp. The mountains in the distance loomed larger, their peaks stretching impossibly high into the sky. The ground beneath his feet changed texture with every step, from jagged rocks to smooth, polished stone to a strange, gelatinous substance that clung to his boots. It was disorienting, but the protagonist pressed on, his mind set on his goal. After what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at the base of one of the towering mountains. A narrow path wound its way up the steep incline, disappearing into the thick mist that clung to the mountain slopes. The dog barked softly, as if urging him to continue. Taking a deep breath, the protagonist began to climb. The path was treacherous, with loose rocks and unstable footing, but he moved with determination, his eyes focused on the distant peak. The higher he climbed, the colder the air became, and soon he was shivering in the thin, biting wind. The dog trotted alongside him, seemingly unaffected by the cold, its fur shimmering with an otherworldly glow. As they ascended, the mist grew thicker, swirling around them in thick, opaque tendrils. It clung to his skin, cold and wet, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But the protagonist pushed forward, trusting his instincts and the presence of the dog at his side. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a plateau near the mountain's peak. The mist cleared slightly, revealing a large, ancient temple carved into the mountainside. Its walls were covered in intricate carvings of strange symbols and figures, and the air around it buzzed with a palpable energy. The dog barked softly, and the protagonist turned to it with a questioning look. "Is this it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The dog's eyes gleamed with intelligence, and it let out a low growl before trotting toward the temple's entrance. The protagonist followed, his heart pounding in his chest. This was what he had been searching for, the heart of the dream realm, the place where the god's power was strongest. As they approached the entrance, the air grew thick with a strange, oppressive force. The protagonist could feel the weight of the god's presence all around him, pressing down on him like a physical burden. His legs felt heavy, his steps slow and labored, but he forced himself to keep moving. Inside, the temple was dimly lit by flickering torches that lined the walls. The carvings continued along the stone walls, depicting scenes of ancient rituals and sacrifices, of mortals bowing before the gods in submission. At the far end of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, and above it, suspended in the air, was a glowing, pulsating orb of light. The dog stopped in its tracks, its gaze fixed on the orb. It let out a soft whine, and for the first time, the protagonist saw a flicker of hesitation in its eyes. "What is it?" he asked, kneeling down to look the dog in the eyes. The dog stared back at him, its eyes filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. Then, without warning, the dog's form began to shimmer and shift. The protagonist gasped as the dog's body dissolved into a cloud of light, reforming into the shape of a man, an older man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. "Uncle," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. The man nodded, his smile bittersweet. "Yes, it's me," he said, his voice soft and soothing. "I've been with you all along." Tears welled up in the protagonist's eyes as he stared at the man who had raised him, the man who had been like a father to him after his own had passed away. But how? The protagonist asked, his voice barely a whisper. How is this possible? His uncle's smile faded slightly, and his gaze turned serious. I've been watching over you, guiding you, ever since I passed. The dream realm, it's where I've been ever since. And now, I'm here to help you understand. The protagonist swallowed hard, his mind reeling with the revelation. Understand what? His uncle stepped closer, placing a hand on the protagonist's shoulder. The gods, the mark, everything, it's all connected to our family. The power you've been struggling with, the dreams, the nightmares, they're not just random. They're part of your heritage, passed down through generations. The protagonist stared at his uncle in shock. Our family, we're connected to the gods? His uncle nodded. Yes. Long ago, one of our ancestors made a pact with the gods. In exchange for power, they agreed to serve the gods in the dream realm, to act as their vessels in the mortal world. That's why the mark appeared on you. It's a sign of that pact. The protagonist's mind raced, trying to process the information. But why? Why was this pact made? And why me? His uncle's expression darkened. The pact was made out of desperation. Our ancestors sought to protect the family from a great danger, and the gods offered a way. But the price was steep. Every generation, one member of our family is chosen to bear the mark, to carry the burden of the gods' power. The protagonist clenched his fists, feeling the mark on his wrists burn with energy. So I'm just a pawn in that game? His uncle shook his head. No. You're more than that. You have the power to break the cycle, to end the pact once and for all. But it won't be easy. The gods are ancient and powerful, and they won't let go of their hold on our family without a fight. The protagonist looked down at the mark on his wrist, feeling the weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He had always felt like his life was not his own, like he was being controlled by forces beyond his understanding. But now, for the first time, he saw a way out, a chance to reclaim his freedom. What do I need to do? He asked, his voice filled with determination. His uncle's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on the protagonist's shoulder. You must enter the heart of the dream realm, confront the gods, and sever the bond that ties our family to them. It won't be easy, and it will require great strength and sacrifice. But I believe in you. The protagonist took a deep breath, his mind racing with the enormity of the task ahead. But he knew he had no choice. If he wanted to be free, if he wanted to save his family, he had to face the gods. With one final nod from his uncle, the protagonist stepped forward toward the glowing orb of light that pulsed above the altar. The air around him buzzed with energy, and as he reached out to touch the orb, a blinding light enveloped him. As the light engulfed him, the protagonist felt his consciousness being pulled deeper into the core of the dream realm. Time seemed to stretch, and his senses blurred, as though he were no longer in control of his own body. When the light finally dimmed, he found himself standing in a vast expanse of blackness, with only the pulsating glow of the orb hovering in front of him. It felt like the world had dissolved into pure energy. He could no longer feel his feet on the ground, no longer hear the wind or the sounds of the temple. It was just him and the orb, alive with an indescribable power, its glow almost hypnotic. You've come this far, a voice echoed from all directions, a voice that sounded like his own but layered with countless others. But do you truly understand the cost of breaking the pact? The protagonist clenched his fists, staring at the orb. I don't care about the cost. I want my family to be free. I want to be free. The orb seemed to pulsate in response, its glow intensifying. Freedom is an illusion. Power is the only reality. Suddenly, the blackness around him began to shift and twist, forming vague shapes and figures. Shadows of long-forgotten memories flickered into view, images of his ancestors, bound to the gods, their faces etched with despair. He saw his own life play out before him, every decision, every thought twisted by the unseen hand of the gods. Then, out of the swirling darkness, figures began to materialize, ancient, towering beings with elongated limbs and faces that shifted like smoke. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and their presence made the air around him crackle with energy. The gods. Why do you resist? One of the gods intoned, its voice reverberating through the protagonist's very bones. You are one of us. You cannot escape your fate. The protagonist felt the mark on his wrist burning again, more intensely than ever before. The pain shot up his arm, spreading through his body, but he gritted his teeth and stood his ground. I'm not one of you, he said, his voice steady despite the pain. I'm my own person, and I'll break the pact, no matter what. The gods moved closer, their forms shifting and blending into one another, becoming an indistinguishable mass of power. The air grew heavy with their presence, and the protagonist could feel his strength draining, his will faltering. Then, just as he was about to collapse under the weight of their power, a familiar voice echoed in his mind. Remember what I told you, his uncle's voice whispered. You're stronger than you know. You have the power to end this. With a surge of determination, the protagonist straightened, his eyes blazing with defiance. He raised his hand, the mark glowing brighter than ever before, and focused all his energy on the orb. The gods hissed in unison, their forms becoming more agitated. You will regret this, they snarled, their voices filled with malice. But the protagonist didn't waver. He channeled every ounce of his will into the orb, forcing it to obey his command. The light grew brighter, blinding in its intensity, and the gods let out a deafening roar as they began to dissolve into the light, their forms unraveling like threads in a tapestry. The ground beneath him shook violently, and cracks began to form in the fabric of the dream realm. Reality itself seemed to be tearing apart. And then, with a deafening explosion of light, everything went black. When the protagonist opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the cold, stone floor of the temple. The orb was gone, and the oppressive presence of the gods had vanished. The air was still, almost serene. He slowly sat up, feeling the weight of his body return. The mark on his wrist was no longer glowing, it was faint, barely visible, as though it had been drained of its power. He had done it. The pact was broken. But as he stood, something felt wrong. The temple around him was no longer the same. The carvings on the walls had changed, now depicting scenes of chaos and destruction. The air felt thick with something dark, something malevolent. And then he heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper in the back of his mind. We're not gone, the voice said, cold and mocking. You've freed us. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, looking for the source of the voice. But there was no one there. Just the empty temple and the weight of the truth sinking in. He hadn't destroyed the gods. He had freed them. The pact, the mark, everything had been a cage, a prison that had kept the gods trapped in the dream realm. By breaking it, he had unleashed them into the real world. A wave of dread washed over him as the implications of his actions became clear. The gods were no longer bound by the rules of the dream realm. They were free to do as they pleased, to exert their will over the mortal world. and he was the one who had set them loose. As the realization settled in, the temple began to shake again, the ground cracking beneath his feet. The walls of the temple seemed to warp and shift, as though the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. The protagonist stumbled back, his mind racing. There had to be a way to fix this, to undo what he had done. But how? The gods were ancient, powerful beyond comprehension. How could he possibly stop them now? Suddenly, the dog, his uncle, reappeared beside him, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry," the uncle said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know this would happen." The protagonist looked at him, panic rising in his chest. "What do we do? How do we stop them?" His uncle shook his head slowly. "I don't know if we can." As the temple continued to crumble around them, the protagonist felt a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had set in motion something far beyond his control, something that could very well destroy everything he had ever known. And there was no turning back. The protagonist stood frozen as the temple continued to collapse around him. His uncle, the dog, glanced at him with the same sorrowful expression. But then, something changed. The mark on the protagonist's wrist began to glow once again, brighter than before, pulsating with a rhythm that matched the tremors of the crumbling world around them. "You've unleashed them," his uncle whispered, but his tone was different now. There was no regret in it, only a hint of something sinister. "But it's not over. There's more to this than you realize." The protagonist looked at his uncle, confusion and dread swirling inside him. "What do you mean?" "I thought..." His uncle's eyes suddenly glowed with a strange, unsettling light. "You thought you could control it. You thought you could break the pact without consequences. But this was never about breaking it." His voice grew darker, deeper, almost unrecognizable. This was about transforming it. The air around them seemed to thicken, growing colder as a creeping realization dawned on the protagonist. The mark on his wrist, it wasn't just a symbol of the god's power. It was something much worse. It was a seed. "You weren't just a pawn in this game," the uncle continued, his voice now laced with malice. "You were always part of it. The gods didn't control you, you controlled them. And now, they've fused with you." The protagonist's heart raced, panic setting in. "No, that's not possible," he stammered, but the burning sensation in his wrist spread, enveloping his whole arm. He could feel something stirring deep inside him, as if the god's very essence had taken root within his soul. The uncle, no longer the comforting figure he once was, stepped closer, a twisted grin on his face. "You've become the vessel. The gods live within you now, their power flowing through your veins. You will reshape this world, whether you like it or not." The protagonist's vision blurred as the power inside him surged. He could feel reality warping around him, the boundaries between the dream realm and the waking world shattering. He was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. His body trembled with the weight of divine energy, a force far beyond his comprehension. And then, in an instant, everything went still. The temple was gone. The ruins, the collapsing walls, vanished. The protagonist stood alone in a vast, endless void. He could no longer feel the ground beneath him, no longer sense the boundaries of his own body. He had become one with the gods. His uncle's voice echoed in the distance, though his form was nowhere to be seen. "You'll create new worlds now, bend reality to your will. But remember, with this power comes a price. You are no longer who you were. You are something more." The protagonist's mind reeled, struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. He had set out to free himself from the gods, only to become their avatar. Their prison. Their creator. The last thing he saw before the void consumed him entirely was the mark on his wrist, glowing brighter than ever, now etched with intricate symbols he couldn't understand. A reminder that his fate was no longer his own. The gods had won. Or had they?